We've been looking at the different figurative and symbolic descriptions of the church in the book of Revelation, and have found that some of them are very counterintuitive, particularly, for example, in the last lecture, the 144,000. Well, we're going to continue that and find the same sort of counterintuitive figurative descriptions of the church in Revelation chapter 11. We begin in Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2, which says, "There was given me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, 'Get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. Leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months.'" So we come to the issue of the temple and the holy city. Now, again, as we've seen with the 144,000, that there are two kind of main ways of looking at these symbolic or figurative descriptions: the literalistic way and the symbolic way, or the figurative way. Now, literalists look at the temple and the holy city as literal, namely, either the preterists view the temple as the literal temple that existed before it was destroyed in AD 70. Futurists look at it as a literal physical temple that's going to be rebuilt shortly before Jesus comes again. And the same with the holy city. Literalists look at the holy city basically as the city of Jerusalem. But again, these literalist positions have little regard for the purpose of the book, which is relevant and is directed to the church at all times. Preterists, as I said in an early lecture, are only focusing essentially on the events that culminate in AD 70, and futurists are essentially disregarding the last 2,000 years and only concentrating on a small bit of history just before Jesus comes again sometime in the future. Furthermore, these literalistic views have little regard for the structure of the book, which, as we saw in an earlier lecture, is what's known as progressively parallel. There are multiple parallel sections of the book which trace the history of the church in symbolic form from the first century up until Christ comes again. And then another section does the same thing using different symbols. So it's basically applying to the church different symbols to show the issues that the church is going to face. And finally, these literalistic positions have very little understanding or regard for the symbolic nature of the book. And one author, I think, puts it very well, and it's scholar G.K. Beale, who says that the literalistic view actually is the reverse of the reality. Many people take you need to take the Bible literally unless forced to do otherwise. But in Revelation, to interpret the popular approach to interpret literally unless you're forced to interpret symbolically should be turned on its head. And again, we saw that at the very beginning of the book when it announces that this is done in symbolic ways to show people it's not like a regular epistle such as an epistle of Paul, even though it is an epistle. But since it's a symbolic book, it needs to be interpreted symbolically unless we're forced to interpret it literally. Now, furthermore, with respect to the temple and the holy city, British scholar Caird, his first name is G.B. Caird, I think makes a very good point, but it stresses the counterintuitive nature of symbolism. When Caird says, when we take into account Revelation's apocalyptic genre, which is expressed symbolically, he says, it is hardly too much to say that in a book in which all things are expressed in symbols. The very last things the temple and the holy city could mean would be the physical temple and the earthly Jerusalem. If John had wanted to speak about them, he would have found some imagery to convey his meaning without lapsing into the inconsistency of literalism. And again, for modern Western minds particularly, this goes against our grain. And yet, we need to put ourselves back into the genre that John was writing in and think symbolically rather than literally. So, let's take a look at the temple as figurative. Again, the temple is a figure of speech. It is a symbol standing for the entire church. Now, we see this throughout the New Testament because the phrase temple of God, which is used here in Revelation 11, verse 1, the phrase temple of God is used approximately a dozen times throughout the New Testament, and every single time, with the possible exception of Matthew 26, verse 61, where Jesus was probably referring to the temple of his own body. All the other times, it's talking about the church. And in fact, sometimes, particularly in Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the church is explicitly referred to as the temple of God. So it should not be surprising that John here in Revelation is using a common phrase for the church, the temple of God, to describe the church. Furthermore, the Greek word for temple here is naos, and the word naos never refers to an earthly physical temple. In Revelation, naos refers either to God's heavenly temple, and in the book here I give about a half a dozen or so citations where naos is used of God's heavenly temple, or the future New Jerusalem, where God and the Lamb are the temple. And in Revelation 3, verse 12, one of the promises Jesus makes to the saints who are overcomers is that they will be made a pillar in the temple of my God. And so, since overcomers are promised that they will be made parts of God's temple, it's not surprising that their identity as the temple is confirmed here in Revelation chapter 11, even while they are on earth. Additionally, look at what is said here in Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. It talks about measuring the temple, but notice something. It's not only measuring the temple, but also those who worship in it. Now, measuring comes from Ezekiel chapter 40 and Zechariah chapter 2. And throughout the Bible, particularly in those instances, measuring is not merely a physical act to determine the size of something, but it has theological significance. And again, that is the issue of symbolism. In symbolism, John is getting to the theological significance of these things. And so the idea of measuring in Ezekiel and Zechariah and elsewhere is not to show distance or size, but the thought is of preservation, not destruction. When God measures something, he measures not in his indignation, but the object is measured basically to show God's ownership of it and his preservation of it. And the reason is, and again, you typically, you might measure a physical building, but according to Revelation 11, verse 1, you don't measure those who worship in it. And you see, God is not interested in preserving physical buildings because, as Stephen said in Acts chapter 7, verse 48, he does not dwell in houses made by human hands. Instead, God is interested in preserving his people, the church, which is his temple. And in Revelation 13, verse 6, that is consistent with what John is saying here in Revelation 11, because in Revelation 13, he says that God's name, and he talks about God's name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. So in Revelation 13, the tabernacle is explicitly compared to and described as and equated as those who dwell in heaven. And therefore, it's no surprise that the temple likewise is equated with the church. Now, the same kind of principle applies to the holy city, because in the Bible, Jerusalem was called the holy city in the Old Testament, and it was called the holy city while Jesus was alive. But after Jesus' resurrection and his ascension, Jerusalem is never again called the holy city. In Revelation, the phrase the holy city is used only 4 times. Here in Revelation 11, verse 2, and also in Revelation 21, verses 2 and 10, and in 22, verse 19. Now, in Revelation 21 and 22, the holy city refers to the New Jerusalem, which is equated with the bride of Christ, in other words, the church. And so once again, these multiple intertextual references dispel the error of literalism when we are trying to interpret apocalyptic symbols in a book such as Revelation. And therefore, as one scholar points out, the holy city is the spiritual Jerusalem of the saints. Now, what about the outer court? Because remember that John was told to measure the temple and those who worship in it, but leave out the outer court, and don't measure it, because it's been given to the nations and they will tread it underfoot for 42 months. Now, there have been different views as to the meaning of the outer court, but again, I think what is going on here, is that the outer court is essentially the outward state of the church. In other words, while the temple and those who worship in it have been measured, in other words, have been preserved and protected by God, in its outward state, the church is going to be trampled underfoot for 42 months. We're going back now to the 3.5-year period, which, as we said at the beginning of the book, was a time originally based on the time of the Maccabean revolt, but it became generalized in Jewish thought in the intertestamental period, in other words, between the Old and the New Testaments, to be any time of great testing of God's people until their final deliverance. That's the way, and so what John is doing, he's taking these Jewish ideas and thoughts, universalizing them to say, basically, the 42 months is not a literal 3.5-year period. It is the time from the first coming until the second coming. We are in those 42 months now. Those 42 months, the 3.5 years, the time, times, and half a time, have lasted about 2,000 years. They will continue to last until Jesus comes again. And it is during that time that we are in a period of great testing. But as Revelation is telling us, God is going to give us final deliverance if we remain faithful. And so the church, in its inner aspect, is secure, but in its outer physical aspect, it can be and will be tread underfoot. And that was true in the Roman Empire when Christians were fed to the lions. That is true in Muslim lands to this day. That's been true in communist countries and around the world in different times and in different places. So what I'm pointing out is these images that John is making of the church as the temple and as the holy city, but leaving out the outer court, are consistent with history, and as with the 144,000 and the great multitude. The 144,000 showed the inner true spiritual nature, a perfect symbolic number of the true church consisting of believing Jews and believing Gentiles, whereas the great multitude shows the outer aspect of the church. So I hope you're seeing that John is using different imagery, but he's conveying similar ideas throughout the book of Revelation. And so this view, it talks about the holy city. Again, we're going to see later on, when we look at Babylon the Great and so on, the holy city contrasts with the great city, Babylon the Great. And it's kind of like, as we will see, Revelation has shown, and we've already hinted at this, there are only two kinds of people in the world. There are those who have the mark of the beast. There are those who are sealed by God. There are those who are the citizens of the great city, Babylon. There are those who are citizens of the holy city, the New Jerusalem. There are those who are the dwellers on the earth, whose real citizenship is on the earth. There are those whose citizenship is in heaven. And so right now, while the church is active, and as we will see, in one sense is reigning, we talked about that when we talked about the church as described in Revelation chapter 5, our kingdom has only been inaugurated. It has not yet been consummated. And so that is why, again, the church itself, the temple, and those who worship have been measured, but the outer court has not been. So we are in the already, but not the not yet of the kingdom. There is still suffering, death, tribulation that we all face, but there will come a time when that ends. And we see this again in one of these wonderful intertextual references in Revelation chapter 21, where it is describing in verses 15 through 17, he's measuring the New Jerusalem. And when we talk about that in a later lecture, we'll see that New Jerusalem, yes, there's a physical aspect, but New Jerusalem is basically talking about the bride of the Lamb, the church. And in the New Jerusalem, in the consummation of the kingdom, he measures the entire New Jerusalem. In other words, he does not leave out the outer court, which is to say that in the consummation, the church is not only known and protected spiritually, but now no longer will be subject to any physical persecution. So you see, these images are consistent. They show that right now, yes, we are protected spiritually, but not physically. But in the age to come, we will be protected totally. Now this leads to the next image in Revelation 11, the two witnesses. Revelation 11, verse 3 says, "And I will grant authority to my two witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days." That's that 3.5-year period, "clothed in sackcloth. These are two olive trees and two lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire flows from their mouth and devours their enemies. So that if anyone wants to harm them, they must be killed in this way. They have the power to shut up the sky so that rain will not fall during the days of their prophesying. And when they finish their testimony, the beast that comes out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified." And then it goes on. Now, once again, as with the temple and the holy city, there are people who take this literally. They look at the two witnesses as two physical people. And since many of the attributes of these two witnesses kind of parallel Moses and Elijah, some people think, well, Moses and Elijah are resurrected and they come back and they're the two witnesses, or two physical individuals kind of like Moses and Elijah. But again, that does not take into account what's going on here, the symbolism. The two witnesses, again, in my opinion, are another figure of speech or symbol for the church as a whole, particularly in its role as faithful witness. Why is that? Well, the symbolism behind the two witnesses is broader than simply Moses and Elijah. For example, the reference to the two olive trees and lampstands is modeled on Zechariah 4. Fire flowing out of their mouths and devouring their enemies is based on Jeremiah 5. And the breath of life coming into them, and when they stood on their feet, which is from Revelation 11:11, after they lie in the street, that comes from Ezekiel 37. So the fact that the symbolism is broader than Moses and Elijah says to me that the symbolism of the two witnesses transcends Moses and Elijah. Furthermore, the attributes of these two witnesses are applied collectively. They're not applied like they're two individuals. And so, for example, in Revelation 11, verse 5, it says, fire flows out of their mouth, not mouths. It's only one mouth. And furthermore, you can't take that statement literally, because fire does not come from the mouth of an individual. So the statement that the mouth is in the singular, fire comes from it, obviously are symbolic and not meant to apply to literal human beings. Furthermore, in chapter 11, verse 8, now my Bible, I use a New American Standard typically because it's typically a very literal translation, but here it gets it wrong. In 11, verse 8, it says, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city. Actually, in the Greek, the word for bodies is singular. It says their dead body will lie in the street. And so, again, the two witnesses are treated as one collective entity, not two individuals. And the two witnesses it talks about in 11, verse 4, are the two olive trees and two lampstands. Now that, I mentioned the olive trees goes back to Zechariah, but in Revelation chapter 1, the lampstands earlier were identified as being the seven churches of Asia. And we saw earlier that the seven churches are representative of all the churches. So if the seven lampstands are churches, it seems to me so are the two lampstands. Now, what's the difference between the seven and the two? Richard Bauckham puts it like this. He says, if seven lampstands are representative of the whole church, since seven is the number of completeness, the two lampstands stand for the church in its role of witness, according to the well-known biblical requirement that evidence is acceptable only on the testimony of two witnesses. So he concludes by saying, these witnesses are not part of the church, but they represent the whole church insofar as it fulfills its role as faithful witness. Now, in Revelation 11, verse 3, it points out that the church as witness prophesies for 3.5 years. We discussed earlier, this is the entire period of time from the first century until the second coming of Christ. And so it goes on to point out that we see even the wording that John uses here indicate that these are not individuals, because it says that the beast comes and makes war against them. Now, you don't make war against individuals. And so what we're talking here is the church as a whole. And so again, I have in your book here that the talk about the making war against them, based ultimately from Daniel 7, verse 21, where Daniel's fourth beast wages war against the saints and overpowers them. So in Daniel's context, the war is not against individuals, but against God's people as a whole. And I mentioned the 3.5 years. that again, assuming, as I've tried to indicate and I discuss in more detail in the book, that the 3.5 years is not literal, but applies to this entire period of time we are in now, that means that the witnesses cannot possibly be individual human beings, because individual human beings do not live for 2,000 or more years. And so we talk about after they're killed, their body will lie in the great city. Throughout the book of Revelation, the great city is a reference to the harlot, Babylon the Great. But as I mentioned earlier, the great city encompasses all who dwell upon the earth, all who give allegiance to the beast. And that is even indicated here in chapter 11, where it says that those from the peoples and tribes and tongues and nations will look on the dead body for 3.5 days. So again, even that's indicating that the great city here is a worldwide entity, not an individual city. And we again get that hint in verse 8. It says, the great city which is mystically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. A lot of people think that's referring to the city of Jerusalem, because Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. But the word, it's mystically, it's called Sodom and Egypt. What John is doing is taking these things. There was a real Sodom. There was a real Egypt. There is a real Jerusalem. But he is using these symbolically and generalizing and universalizing them to say that the great city is not an individual city. It's not even an individual empire. It is a worldwide entity. Any culture, any entity, any religion, any socioeconomic or philosophy, culture, or society that is opposed to Christ is part of the great city, Mystery Babylon. And finally, it talks about here in 11 verse 10, those who dwell on the earth will rejoice. Now, those who dwell on the earth, that is a phrase that comes up again and again. It's talking about those whose allegiance is worldly, on the earth, as opposed to those whose citizenship is in heaven. So again, those who dwell on the earth, they're worldwide. They are opposing the church, which is worldwide. Again, it's you're one or the other camp. It's either or. And at the end of Revelation 11, it talks about that the breath of life from God comes into them. They stood on their feet. Great fear fell upon the people on the earth. They went up to heaven, and in that hour there was a great earthquake, and so on and so forth. Now, this is indicating the vindication of the church, and I think may well be talking about the resurrection that occurs as part of the second coming of Christ. And so the imagery here of the breath of life coming into them is derived from Ezekiel 37, verses 5 and 10. It's part of the prophecy of the dry bones. And so it talks about they lay in the city for 3.5 days, but that sort of corresponds, and we'll talk about this later on, to the short time Satan is given to deceive the nations. But the fact of the matter is, and we talked about this earlier also, it talks about in that hour, the resurrection occurs in that hour in which there's a great earthquake. The hour is it's what's known as a term of art, indicating that's the hour of Christ's second coming and the judgment it entails. And as we said in an earlier lecture, the earthquake is also a typical biblical symbol indicating the coming of God in judgment on the earth. So what we're seeing here, and it may be somewhat counterintuitive to a literalistic mind, is the temple, the holy city, the two witnesses are all different descriptions of the church in its role as faithful witness. It will be prophesying during the period before Christ comes again. It will face great tribulation and persecution, but it ultimately will triumph. And in the next lecture, we will look at other symbols of the church in Revelation.